we have been treated to a very remarkable analysis, including an analysis of myself.
My fault.
And there are a number of things which I think we want to discuss later. But I thought it was perhaps as the seminar deals in one aspect with astrology, I thought it is perhaps better to clarify a little some of the ideas in a very confused field of activities and thoughts. Sometimes I doubt it is so much thought rather than feelings and expectations and hypotheses and so on. As you perhaps know, I have made a very strong differentiation between what I call an astrology which is event-oriented and an astrology which is person-centered. And all my work has been, for the last almost 40 years, dealing with a person-centered astrology. The title of my first book was on astrology was the Astrology of Personality. Before I go any further, I think it is good to give a little very broad and very sketchy historical insight into the development of astrology, because I think this is sorely lacking in any book on astrology. In the first part of my book, Astrological Houses, which was published by Doubleday and get it in paperback, I tried to explain the different, the three big steps, or especially two, but the third one starting in the development of astrology. And though it refers largely to the concept of houses, but nevertheless it's essential in a much deeper sense. Now, first let me say that I do not think that there is one astrology with a capital A. I don't think there is one of anything. I don't think there is one science. What we deal with in modern science is a particular type of Western society, kind of knowledge. But every culture and society has its own brand of science, it has its own brand of religion, culture, and it has its own brand of astrology. And I think it's a very serious misunderstanding to think that all astrology is started at a certain period in Chaldea somewhere, and that it is a continuous development from one historical phase to another historical phase without any basic change in the frame of reference of astrology. Actually, there are, at least up to date, three, and we can think of a fourth, definite frame of reference for astrological concepts. And the first one is very sadly misunderstood, or not understood at all, or not even thought about. Archaic astrology, and as far as we know, there has been astrology in the world as long as mankind is in existence, or at least some form of relationship of man to the sky and to the universe as a whole. In the archaic period, up to the Greek period, let us say, though it changed a little bit the late centuries, but When you deal with the archaic kind of astrology, you deal with what I call locality-centered astrology. And this becomes fairly obvious if you realize that, as far as we know, and not thinking of the concept of Atlantis or other completely different types of humanities, not merely of societies, but of humanities. Now, as long as we have any knowledge of, we are dealing with tribal cultures, and a tribe by almost definition is a relatively small, at first anyway, small group of human beings, not necessarily along purely family line or paternalistic line, but anyway, a rather small group of people who operate in a very definite locality. And basically, and for a long period, probably, do not travel more than a few miles, or in certain cases of nomadic countries, maybe a few hundred miles, from the place where they are born or where they exist. That place, as it has been mentioned by many anthropologists and Mircea Eliade, what's his name? Eliade, particularly, is always considered to be the center of the world. Even if you go into American Indian tribes like in Taos or Zuni or any Pueblo, at the center of the plaza there is a place there which is the center of the world. You go through there is, in some respect at least, to the center of the world. The path is there which go to the center of the world. And the kibas or most of those things are somewhat underground. They are already going down into that central thing, which is the source of all. Now, the thing is locality center. It is an expression of the land. It has a very close relation to the fauna and the flora of that land, the climate, the weather condition, to the thing that you can eat, and therefore the type of chemical process that take place in the body and effect on the glands and so on. And also it has a very definite style to look at. And especially if you believe that, which seems to be the case in many cases anyway, if not all cases, that in all tribal culture the world was supposed to be more or less flat. Whether it was flat or not didn't matter too much. I don't know whether they had so much geometrical things about the flatness or the roundness or whatnot. But it was a local thing, it was a circle. And you lived into that circle, that was your land, that's where you belong. Now, there was the things which was below the horizon, and that was the earth, the solidity of the earth and all that. And then you had the sky. And what you saw of the sky was very definite. It was a flat thing, round things above the dome of the heaven. And you saw the sun rise in the east and go up around there, and at night you began to see stars rising also in the east, and the sun, the moon, the stars were all moving. Concept of fixed stars, nothing to do with that at all. Everything was moving in that vast thing, and the essential thing was the rising, the culminating, and the setting. And there was a great deal of attention in some cases as to what star was first seen in the east when the sun was setting in the west, or the first star that appeared in the west after it was dark enough to see the first star, which had to do with what they call the heliacal rising of a star. This was very strongly featured in Caldera and in Egypt, for instance, and related to the inundation of the Nile. And you have the same thing in the Ganges, or the same thing in the Chinese Yellow River, or any of the rivers alongside of which those primitive tribal culture mostly developed. See some kind of valley of some sort where there is water and where you could begin to cultivate. That was the so-called vitalistic period of mankind, where they began to have a complete picture of life as being the very root of all existence, which they consider as a vast kind of ocean, or say vast things that filled everything, filled the sky and filled the earth in a different way. In the sky, that life operated apparently through those mysterious points or discs of light, and in the dark was more the receptive thing. The nature naturance which operated, which was the formative principle of in the sky, and there was nature receiving those influences and producing a crop. So that everything that happened was an expression of two things. There was the positive factor, which was the sky, and there was the negative factor, which was the raw earth, which of course at some times was under all sorts of strange events, and which created a great deal of confusion and trouble, especially in the early part of humanity, when you were in the swamps and the age perhaps of the great reptile and all that, where life was in jungle life in India, where everything was dangerous, there was chaos, you never knew what was going to happen the next moment. So the primordial experience, and if you want to speak of an empirical basis for astrology, I always say that the primordial experience of astrology was the realization that there were two aspects to the universe, as it were, the earth and the sky. And you probably know that supposedly at one time the earth was all covered with a very heavy fog, and that you could not see the sky except the light that seeped through that fog of the sun and perhaps of the moon. And you can imagine, let us say that at the time when the fog began to rise a little more, and some hardy soul climbing on top of a mountain, high mountain, and suddenly at night finding themselves above some of the fog, and suddenly the immediate experience of that tremendous dark things, with those millions of dots of light and things like that. This is the great first empirical experience on which you might say astrology is based. The contrast between the sky and the experience of the sky and all what it implied. And then as you began to be aware of it, you realize that the things that were moved in a very orderly fashion, that they were predictable, that the sun would rise and the sun would set, and that the moon would do this, and it had the change of phases and change of shape, and certain stars would rise at certain season of the year, and other time they would not rise, or at different hours and things like that. All those things establish the difference between the sense of order in the universe, which was located in the sky, and the dark, passive, chaotic condition of the earth. And later on, of what happened in the larger societies, and where man's passion and man's emotion became more complex than they were in the early tribe, where really the tribal unit was the entity the whole, and there was really no individuals. There was superficial difference between tribesmen, but they were all united in the depth of, or even not even the depth, in the middle of their psyche. And every decision were taken more or less unanimously under the compulsion of that unity principle, which was just as compulsive as instincts are compulsive for an animal. So that when you are dealing with the primitive astrology, you are dealing with that very definite difference between the sky, which is the symbol of order, and therefore of the creative forces of the universe, the gods, the things that make things happen, that give a sense that there is some order somewhere in the universe, you see. And the apparent chaos of the earth, and the passivity, receptivity of the soil. You plant seed in it, and things grow out of it when the time the sun comes and hits it in the right way, and so on. So that is really the very basic foundation of astrology. And all what you are dealing with is first the two things which are called the two lights, the sun and the moon, which were not considered at the time as planets at all, but as light, the two lights, the light of the day and the light of the night. And in the era of the vitalistic religions, or the cults of fertilities and so on, they were related, of course, to the polarities of life, the male and the female, and they were worshipped, or what is the symbol of what's worshipped in terms of the male organ and the female organ in rites of fertility, where you became one, you allow the rhythm of that life energy to flow through the man and the woman and create a progeny or generate forces which would produce a progeny in the earth in the term of a harvest. So that you have a relatively very simple thing. And the astrology was kept completely on. You divided the sky probably into 4 sections that create the earliest 4 houses of a type of chart which is only 8 hours. And by analogy, they were the 4 below the earth you could not see. And the sun, the moon, the stars were moving, and the planet were, the word planet means wandering, wanderer, because they realized that some of those dots of light were always keeping their own relative form to each other. That was the origin of constellation, you see. Because those stars which kept their constant shape, the form of it being constant, was very different from those little dots of light, and sometimes even little discs like Dane still see and so on, which move very erratically in the sky, even move back and forth at retrograde motion, move in the direction of the sun, and sometimes they move in the opposite direction. So they became the wanderer, they became the planets. And the position of the sun, the position of the moon, and the position of these wandering dots of light, planets, were measured in relation to the horizon, but also because you had to make a connection between them, establish pattern if you want to deal with pattern of order as soon as the mind began to deal with geometry and space arrangement and all that. Then you use the pattern of those dots of light, those stars, which were called fixed, not because they didn't move, because everything was moving, but because their motion were always keeping them in the same relative form. So what is fixed is not the star, but it is the group of stars, which we call constellations. Now every race had different type of constellations, and the idea was that all those groups of stars, those constellations, were representative of the bodies of divine hierarchies, which would operate through the universe and be the source from which all life activities and later on as it developed consciousness activity would operate, because they represent the polarized positive aspect of life. Now those constellations which were near the path which the moon and the sun and the planet crossed, all the year around, were divided into 12 constellations and became constellation of the zodiac. Now, I am completely convinced that the serialized astrologers who deal with the zodiac of constellations were right as far as archaic astrology was concerned, which was an astrology where you actually looked at the sky and see what you saw. The moon, or you could see the sun on the background of the star, but you could see the moon anywhere on the background of the star. And the first zodiac were almost certainly lunar zodiac, divided into 27 or 28 period, which dealt with the 27, 28 period of the moon, from new moon to new, not from new moon to new moon, but from the position of the moon in relation to a fixed star to the place, the time it took for the moon to come back again in the same position. So you had there a very simple things. You had a background, you had things moving on the background, and you just plotted out the different position of those things, and whether it was rising, whether it was culminating, whether it was in between the rise and the culminating, and it was related probably to day activity, agricultural activity, and so on. Okay, now, a time came when the picture of the universe began to change. Time grew into kingdoms, big cities were established, priests became established in corporation of priesthood, corporation of astrologer. They began to realize that there were things that were happening on Earth at the time when certain conjunction or certain star was rising, or the sun was doing something in relation to the moon and so on, and they established a pattern. Okay, now the thing first was purely for agricultural purpose, for collective purpose, for the tribe. No individual was at all involved in a birth chart or anything of that nature. It is only when you reach the late Chaldean Babylonian stage, and especially Alexandria and Athens and Rome, that you begin to make charts for individual persons. And of course, at first it was purely chart for the king. And there was not so much the chart for the king, but for the time the king, the reign of the king started. Because the important thing was what happened to the tribe, to the society, to the kingdom, not to the person as a person. So there was no personal meaning at all to astrology in early days whatsoever. It was only, and if people tell you about some of the Chaldean or Babylonian chart, they refer already to a very strongly developed type of culture and society, as complex in a certain sense as Alexandria or later Athens or Rome was. But you see, apparently a time came where the tribal thing broke into a more social pattern where people became increasingly individualized. People emerged from the tribe with certain consciousness of being different from other people, separate from them, they had particular problem of their own, a particular thing. They were the best people in that, they were different from that. And so you begin to get the process of what I call individualization process, where the person becomes finding himself as a separate, more or less autonomous person, though at first this is very superficial and they are still rooted very deeply into the land, the kingdom, the religion, and so on. And you can trace more or less the beginning, at least symbolically, of that period of individualization going full blast anyway, or starting to go full blast. It is symbolized in the story of Moses reaching God who present himself to him as the I am that I am. I am merely that I am. In other words, there is nothing but merely that I amness, that principle of individualization, that principle of being a complete whole, complete separate thing, which can say I, which in a certain sense was not the tribal consciousness at all in the early days. And then you begin to get similarly the change into a type of world picture which certainly in Greece and possibly a little before got the concept of that the solar system, that the Earth was not the center of the world, that things were not just turning around your locality, but that you are part of a larger whole, the globe, the Earth, and that in turn was round and turning around the sun. In other words, we begin to get the concept of a solar system with the Earth as a unit, as a whole, which is a sphere, and all human beings actually belonging to them, to that whole. And that concept, of course, which has become remarkably crystallized and in a very literal sense, very recently, a few years ago, when the first human beings were able to travel on space and see the Earth as a little thing out of their window, which every astronaut apparently said was the most, by far, the most striking experience of their journey. I mean, Ed Mitchell had been particularly articulate in saying that it changed his whole life. You see, to realize that the Earth was there. Well, the moment you are dealing with a Earth which is turning around the solar system, then what becomes the important thing is the relationship of the Earth to the Sun, because the Sun becomes the center of the system, and everything begins to turn around it. So you begin to have a certain kind of astronomy or world picture which is both geocentric and heliocentric. It is heliocentric in the sense that it deals with the Sun as a center of a particular large system of which all the different planets and the Earth belong. But it is geocentric in the sense that the important thing, the most essential thing at first, is that you are belonging to that Earth, and that every sense of value has to deal with the concept of the Earth as a whole. And then you begin to have an astrology, you see, which is based on the relationship of the Earth as a whole to the Sun and to the other poles which are operating in the solar system, which are the planets revolving around that Sun. And all what you have today, still in your ephemeris and all your astrological books, refer to the center of the Earth. All measurements are in terms of the center of the Earth and the center of the planet. So that astrology today, for instance, is not dealing with physical masses at all. It's just merely dealing with the orbital motion of abstract points which are the center of the Earth, and the center of the Sun, and the center of the Moon. And it makes quite a difference in the sense of the Sun, because it's certain thing of about a degree or so or more of the zodiac, and so that the center can be floating very much, you see. But you are dealing with the motion of center, you are dealing with the relationship between a complex system of motion, which you can translate as a complex system of activities. and you begin to see the solar system as an organic system, as an organic whole. And what I mean by organism or organic is a system of activities which are all more complexly interrelated and interdependent. Whenever you have a system of activities which has a definite limit, definite boundaries, and in which everything is interconnected, interrelated, and mutually interdependent, you have an organism in the real sense of the term. So in a certain sense, if you have a nation or a business organization which have a definite structure, a definite center, president in there, a definite law of organization which has certain type of activity, each of which is related to all the others, you have an organism. And then you begin to deal with astrology as the capacity to deal with organic whole and to deal with the functional activities of that organic whole. And then you see what you are dealing with is the relationship of all those different functions to the center, which is the sun. Therefore, what is important is the orbit rather than the planet, and it is the division of the orbit, which is the changing, which establishes changing relationship, seasonal relationship between the source of all light and life and power of the sun and the earth. No longer a flat little locality, but complete whole. And so you deal then to a different kind of zodiac, which is the zodiac of sign of the zodiac, which are nothing to do with constellation whatsoever, but which are simply the division of the orbit of the Earth into 12 sections, and which correspond therefore with the change in the seasons. You see, because the orbit is elongated, it's an ellipse, it's not, and the Earth itself is inclined. The plane of the equator is inclined to the plane, does not coincide with the plane of the orbit, which is called ecliptic. So that there is that inclination, so that the Earth, as it revolves around it during the summer and winter and all that, receives the sun rays from a different angle, which creates changing heat, changing magnetism, and so on. So you have a seasonal cycle, a yearly cycle, which no longer represent as anything to do with the position of the sun or the moon in relation to the fixed stars, so-called, but which is purely an expression of the relationship of the Earth to the sun. And you have, therefore, the kind of astrology which has been developed since the Greek period, and which deals with the sign of the zodiac and no longer with the constellation of the zodiac. And I'm sorry to say that Jung was so little understood astrology that he made a remarkable blunder in saying something there, for instance, I don't know if I mark it here, I think I marked it. He said there, for instance, in the case of astrology, for instance, this age-old scientia intuitiva, intuitive science, came to be branded as rank heresy because man had not succeeded in making the psychological description of character independent of the stars. Even today, people who still believe in astrology fall almost without exception for the old superstitious assumptions of the influence of the stars. And yet anyone who can calculate a horoscope should know that since the day of Hipparchus of Alexandria, the spring point has been fixed at 0 degree areas, and that the zodiac on which every horoscope is based is therefore quite arbitrary, the spring point having gradually advanced since then into the first degree of Pisces, owing to the precession of the equinox, which makes no sense at all, but which is unfortunately the thing that every science critic of astrology keep on harping on it as if it meant anything, which is of course the fault of the astrologer who still are talking about the nature is spread all over the planet as I see mankind as a very definite function in the life of the whole earth, just like the animal kingdom has a definite function, the vegetable kingdom has a function, the ocean and the ocean current and the stratosphere and the Van Allen band shielding the earth from destructive vibration and all that. All those things have definite function into the organism of the earth. And the earth is an organism, it is, and we are part of it, just like the nervous system or the brain is part of the total human being. And that until humanity is beginning to realize that it's part of the planet, that it doesn't drop as a stranger from some mysterious heaven to a bad lesson to work out or trouble to go through or escape sin or God knows what on Earth's life. We never will understand anything, and especially there is no possibility of having any ecological peace of mind or any sense of a real relationship with nature, because we still go function along the old biblical system that God put us there as complete control of doing anything we want with the earth. You see. And until we have not seen that all Hebraic conception, Hebraic Christian conception, all ecological protest and all that will be futile, perfectly futile, because we have not seen the basic consciousness of the earth, of mankind in relation to the earth. That you have not realized that mankind as a whole is participating in the activities of the earth as a whole. And you cannot understand occultism, and that's a kind of digression, but you cannot understand occultism and all the reference to guiding hierarchies or the spiritual hierarchy of the planet or the White Lodge or any of those things, or sacred mountain or sacred spots and lodges and all that, unless you realize that you are dealing with factors which are as part of the total planet as an organism, as when you deal with the chakra, for instance, in the body, center within that whole organism of the human total person. So that you are dealing with something which deals with human nature as a whole. And when somebody look at your chart and say there is a square and this and so on, in terms of the zodiac, in terms of the relation to the sun and so on, it deals with human nature within you, but it doesn't deal with you as an individual person, with an individualized truth of being, an individual dharma, an individual inner reality, which has to fulfill its answer to a particular function or need by the very fact that you are born at a particular point and particular time on the surface of the earth. And that you are therefore a kind of cell within that body of the earth, and the place of that cell and the time at which it operates has to do with the function that it has to do. And that if you want to fully realize your total being, you have to first try to understand what that function is. If the cell of the liver were wondering, my God, where am I? Should I do this, or should I do that, or should I secrete this, or should I produce this? You would have a beautiful mess, you know. And of course, if you go to the other extreme, if the cell say, well, I belong nowhere, I am myself alone, I belong nowhere, I'm in relation to nothing else, then you have the cancer. You see, a cell which stops functioning as a cell and try to function as a completely autonomous, autarkic individual without any relation with anything around it. Now, then you see, from that you can emerge to the conception of what I call a person-centered astrology, where what you are dealing with is the relationship between a particular individualized person with a particular field of consciousness and all that, in relation to the universe as a whole, but specifically, of course, in relation, more concretely, in relation to the planet and the solar system, But still, because you can begin to imply another higher system of reference, which would be the galaxy rather than the solar system, you have to take into consideration practically the whole universe, or at least the whole Milky Way. You see, the moment you are moving from one level of wholeness to another level of wholeness, first you have the little time as a whole within a very definite, circumscribed space, which is nowhere in relation to anything that the Earth. I mean, you don't question where it just is there, and everything turns around it. Then you have the next things, which is the Earth as a whole, as a planet, which has a definite part of the solar system, and so on. And that is all that you can think of, really. But still in that solar system, and I might say there, so I forget, that the real solar system in astronomy, in astrology really, ends with Saturn, which is the limiting process, the limiting function of establishing a boundary to your consciousness and to your activities. You are limited by your skeleton, but you're probably also limited by some kind of auric field around you, which probably has some kind of layer, reflecting layer, like the Van Allen bands or the ionosphere reflect the thing there, and which individualize your organism, or separate or particularize your organism in terms not of physical substance, but in terms of the electromagnetic field, you see, which is the real you in a certain sense, which is the total you. Then you see, you go and the whole concept, however, that there are strange things that happen sometimes beyond Saturn, beyond that ego consciousness, which has established a very definite field. What belongs here is good or fine or valuable. What is outside of it is the foreigner, is the enemy, is the alien, and all that. I have to be careful. You go back again to the old tribal system, but this time in terms of a psychic reality. But you begin to realize that there are strange things sometimes that happen from outside of what seems to be outside of the system, which affect the things that take place here. There is revolution, there is upset, there are all sorts of things, famine and catastrophe and epidemic of psychic as well as physical and so on. So you begin to realize that there are possibility of transformation, of change, of mutation. And when you begin to realize that collectively, when you begin, that thing has come to a point in the evolution of mankind where the need for transformation become extreme, then you discover planets. You discover Uranus, you discover Neptune, you discover Pluto. You discover them because you have developed intellectual capacities to find them. And it is the development of those intellectual capacities which also created the trouble you are living in, you see, and which also are indication that some change is going to, that there is some basic transmutation or transformation that should occur. So, because we are in a cycle of transformation, because we begin to be able to go beyond the concept of the solar system and deal with what Jung still call in a very broad sense the collective unconscious. You have to have some functions which deal with the relationship of that unknown, mysterious external world with the inner world, which is inside of Saturn orbit. And the function of transformation then become the Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto, and there may be some more, at least one more planet, I'm sure. And you deal there with what, on an occult sense, you call the path, the mystic path of transformation, where you go beyond the Saturnian ego, and you go into what? Well, you don't go into something that is vague and fluid and that you vaguely call as collective or so. You go into a very definite entity, which is the galaxy, which we know is a definite system of stars, which has a definite spiral form, which you can see, our telescope can examine. We see even outside of that, there are also other things like the Andromeda Nebula and all that, which prefigure what you are really in. You can measure the path of the solar system around it, which takes apparently something like 200 million years around the galaxy, and therefore you have already a prefiguration of a larger frame of reference, which is the galaxy. But in the process today of transformation, you see, from the collective human nature, which is the root of your being, and a potentiality of linkage with a wider than solar systemic, or as I call it, heliocosmic. I think it's a very good term, heliocosmic. The heliocosmic system, you see, of the solar system. You go from that into the galactic whole, which is the next higher cosmos, the larger, most inclusive cosmos. And of course, there are still, you can call it the finite universe in the Einsteinian sense, or you can think whatever you want. But at the present time, anyway, we know that we are part of the solar, as the solar system is part of a galaxy, and there are also millions of other galaxies which we can more or less attain through our instruments. So the thing there, you see, is that period of transition from the strictly solar system, the strict heliocosm, which is limited by Saturn, and the galaxy, which is the next frame of reference. You see. At that period of transition, it is possible for an individual, you see, to move from one frame of reference to the next frame of reference, to the higher frame of reference. And therefore, all the emphasis is put there on the individual person and no longer on human nature. Human nature becomes the given, you see. But the next thing, the galactic nature, is the as yet unknown. There's a beautiful phrase of Oliver Reiser in one of his books, or I think he has repeated several times, and that says, when God becomes known, he becomes man. Or he used the term, and I think it was also used by some mathematician last century, I can't remember the name now, which speaks very much hyphenated, as yet unknown. The galaxy is the as yet unknown, but we know already that there are centers, there are stars, and the medieval astrologer were beginning fumblingly to try to reach that higher things through such thing as alchemy and also astrology to some extent, had already all sorts of characteristics given to some of the so-called fixed stars, some of the big stars, Betelgeuse, Sirius, Pleiades, Antares, and so on, you see. But for them, you see, anything which could be traced to that fixed star, to the realm of the galaxy, they didn't know yet it was a galaxy. They thought it was merely strange entities outside, you see, appeared as a catastrophe, or at least as something most unusual. Sometimes to give extraordinarily good fortune and power, but most times very dangerous, which again you have something like the eruptions from the contents of the collective unconscious. And the occultists, alchemists, warn against identifying yourself with the angel of the great star angels, because you could be thrown out of the path of human development, fascinated by some big star, which is actually, according to the occult thing, the body of a god, of an angel, or whatever you want to call it, archangel or whatnot. So you see, you have the situation today in astrology where you are dealing with the process of transformation between the solar heliocosmic frame of reference into the galaxy frame of reference. And because of that, you have that capacity to change gear. And the changing of gear is what the occultist speaks as the path of initiation. Initiation being essentially the fact that you in some way become related to the star, which is your galactic identity. It is not a symbol, it is not a fantasy or a dream and all that, it is an actual fact. You are part of the galaxy, it is a fact, we know it. And the whole idea that there are as many stars in the galaxy, in the Milky Way, that there are human souls on Earth, it may be very perfectly valid. I mean, I don't know. Let's put it as a theory or an hypothesis. But the point is that theoretically, everyone has a star, which theoretically or symbolically is the star immediately overhead, which is not the midheaven. So the midheaven is there, the star overhead is exactly overhead. It prolongs the line of your spine from the center of the Earth, which is the center of human nature, to that particular star which represents your galactic function, your galactic identity. But you see, we don't know yet, or at least publicly, we have no real understanding of what the galaxy is. We know more or less its shape and all that, but we know more or less where the sun is in it. But we don't know, we have no way, we have not devised yet a mythology of all the stars, you see. We don't know what is the center of the system. So you have a kind of spiral mandala, but the mandala means nothing unless you are able to work from the center. And therefore, we can, as long as we have not reached the center or have a real understanding or perception or superior perception of the center of the galaxy, which you may call God if you want, then of course we would know where the different stars belong, because you see, the planets, for instance, the meaning of the planets, some people very often have asked me, how do you know that Mercury means this or Venus means that and so on? Well, the empirical astrologers say, oh well, centuries after century, all sorts of experiments and experience have been recorded and we have proven and this, which may be true to some extent. But still, it's not the essential factor. As I said in my astrology personality, astrology is a deductive science, it's an algebra. It's an algebra of life or an algebra of consciousness, if you want, also at a higher level. It's a deductive principle. Mercury means something because it is the first planet near the sun. Venus means something because it is just next. We are there next and we are surrounded by Venus and Mars. So Mars means everything which goes outward. Venus means everything that goes inward. You see. And then you have Jupiter and you have the band of the asteroid, which has probably a certain kind of general significance. And you have Jupiter, and which is the social planet, and because the cooperation, based on the cooperation of human beings and all that, Saturn establishing that cooperation, establishing a law, establishing boundaries, and so on. So you have there the complete system, you see. And the planet has its meaning in terms of where it is in the system. You are mean the first breakthrough from the Saturnian thing because it's next planet to Saturn. When you have broken through a fortified castle and all that, you see something and the whole thing gets losing and get confused, and you have that agent that dissolves those boundaries, and you have Neptune there, the great solvent, the universal solvent of the alchemist and so on. Then you have the complete breaking out of everything into its essential constituents, its atoms, and primordial substance in a way, within which there is the seed of the new development, and you have Pluto. And I think there should be another planet there, which I, years ago, tentatively called Proserpine, which is then the beginning of the reintegration at any new level. And with like Proserpine in the system, in the Greek mythology, which comes part of the time in the underground, which would be in that sense, you see, in terms of the galaxy, part of the time within the Saturn orbit and part of the time in the galaxy. And I have called Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto as the ambassadors of the galaxy. They are in the solar system. They are still subject to the power of the sun because it's very strong and powerful. But they are not of it. They are in it, but not of it. Just like the apostles, according to Jesus. Well, I have talked a lot, but I mean, that is to see the broad picture that I think you have to understand if you want to make sense of astrology, and particularly to make sense of astrology today. What I call the person-centered astrology is the type of astrology which particularly should fit the need of the individual of today, who is operating in a period of transition, in a period of chaos, in a period of reformulation, deconditioning and restructuring, mostly deconditioning today, you see. Deconditioning from the Saturnian family patterns and all those things like that, you see. And which eventually can become restructured from the point of view of the galaxy. Or at least at the present time can begin to try to think in terms of galactic concept of universal archetypes of things which have their existence in a world, in a whole, in a system of activities, of which the whole solar system and of course the Earth in it and we in it are only a very small part. But small or not small doesn't make any difference because you are not dealing there with physical structure. You are essentially, the moment you get into the zone of the galaxy and all that, you are dealing with tremendous energy, you are dealing with light, you are dealing with all sorts of things of which we have still no conception very much. And you can live. Well, to mention just a word again, where I was having difference with Jung. When Jung speaks of transpersonal, he means that which is beyond the personality, above, beyond. What I mean by transpersonal, and I have used the term since 1930, is a type of activity where the person acts as a lens, as a clear lens, clear channel, but lens is really better, through which the power of the universe, the power of the galaxy, the power of spirit can become focused into physical, concrete activity. So it's a descent, not an ascent. And I think it's unfortunate that this point of view is not mentioned. I wrote an article about it for the Transpersonal Psychology magazine, and they didn't like it too much because I didn't quote enough books and I didn't have reference and things like that, because it is the difference between, to conclude, it's the difference between the typical concept of the avatar, in India, which is the divine manifestation, God coming into matter, and the mystic, which is the man who is born into a very strict structure of tradition, religion, and all that, and begin slowly to see through it and reach the unity state of the universal life or universal consciousness. One is a kind of descent of the spirit, the other one is a progressive ascent and refinement and universalization of consciousness. If you really go by that picture, you can, some of the questions that Dr. Brook mentioned, there can be seen in that light and becomes acquire a very definite, much more definite meaning. Like the idea of function, the idea of wholeness, relatedness, and so on, you see. You are dealing, you see, it is not that I am starting from the collective and the individual going to the collective, that I am starting from a base of operation, from an organized system of activities, which is the ego pattern when you deal with the individual today, which is the ego structure of the tradition of the culture, the basic image of that culture and all that. And then you go from that through the process of transmutation and transformation, which has to operate through an individual, essentially. Then it's spread out in the collectivity. But this process reaching towards a higher structural and structured system of activity, which symbolically you can consider as or cosmically you can consider as the galaxy, but which in terms of our present today experience, of course, the only practical greater whole that you can really consider is the planet Earth as a whole. Now, what I stressed in my book Planetarization of Consciousness, for instance, is that truth is completely relative to a phase of a cycle in which the person who has that truth is expressed, is living. So that instead of truth, you should speak of validity. Every phase of consciousness, every phase of the development of mankind has certain things that are valid, valuable for the fulfillment of that particular phase of consciousness. And one of the reasons why I stress the idea of the cycle and all that is because at a time when we are at a process of bringing together or at least in contact with dozens, hundreds of different points of view and cultural, ethnological, metaphysical views of reality, so-called. It is very important to me that it's essential that one should find a concept, what Jung would call an image of salvation, which really brings all those things to their own place within a larger pattern. And if you don't do that, then you have to take for believing that one thing is true, yours, and the other one is probably half true, or maybe it was true sometimes or something, but this is not true, really true, and things like that, because science really sees things the way they are and things like that. Mm-hmm. Which to me is just as much a priori statement as or a paradigm that to say that there is nothing material and everything is spiritual, for instance, that kind of things.
Now let me, and it's hard for me to separate out what I would think Jung might say or ask. Yes. I find myself understanding your position when you speak of the truth of the individual. The phenomenological truth of the individual is true for him. That is what he subjectively experiences. And I find myself able to encompass the criticism of taking a particular view of reality, namely the view of empirical science as the truth. This I can go along with, but what I run up against, and I think this might go along with what Jung might say, what I run up against in my thinking is the following kind of problem. See, dealing clinically with people who are in distress, I move to what I call the phenomenological position very most of the time. That is, what is one's own truth is truth for him. I have no problem with that. But what I find myself having a problem with, let me give two examples. One is, there comes to attention what I call, for want of a better term, the Hitler problem, in which a single individual developed a truth of his own, which included, for example, the feeling and the apprehension and the subjective realization that the Jewish race was responsible for most of the ills of mankind, as long as he kept it with himself, it was his own problem. But at some level, he sold it to a nation of people so that a series of murders of around 12 million people could then subsequently occur. Now, that's one example. The other example is a less striking one.
Which is not the first time it happened.
Oh, no, not at all.
And we have done pretty well in Vietnam.
Oh, yeah, it's happening all the time. That's just one example. More closer to home, what I discover in clinical work is that often I find that the truth that an individual experiences is valid for him, and there's a clinical sense, an intuitive sense of going with it, and going with that truth and helping the individual go with it opens up his possibility or his potential as an individual. I also find people clinically who are hiding behind their truths, whose personal truths are used as a screen between them and the world, between them and their own fears. When sometimes the problem of the therapist in that sense is to probe beneath the screen of the subjective truth which the individual experiences. Let me give an example. A young man came to see me one time and told me a dream, first time he'd seen me. The dream involved a church spire. He was standing beneath a church spire, watching as the church spire rose to the heavens. When he related the dream to me, he said, this was a young man, very bright, about a master's degree level of education, who had been rather thoroughly indoctrinated with various psychological points of view. He said about his dream, well, of course, that church spire is only a penis symbol. Now, in the back of my mind, I knew that particular individual, at some point in his development, would have to take a whole new look at that imagery. And going with the metaphor, I had certain kind of intuitions. That particular young man, 7 or 8 years later, is now very deeply involved in some personal spiritual studies of his own. And his life has proceeded to make manifest the church spire in his dream. But his truth, namely that the church spire was a penis symbol, was a way of hiding himself from, it turned out later, other truths that he had to realize in himself. Now, my problem clinically, and I think probably Jung's problem clinically, since he was a clinician and primarily worked in trying to heal people, was in making the distinction between two qualities of subjective truth. So how would you go about making the distinction between those two kinds of truth, the truth of Hitler, if you will, the truth of this young man with the church spire, and the truth which somehow leads to the individuation
for
path?
one thing, I am not a doctor or a psychiatrist, so thanks God, and therefore I don't have to actually face that problem. My problem is that I haven't stressed so much the matter of the truth of the individual in the sense in which you are talking about it, in relation to a particular experience and so on. What I am looking at is not right as you. Well, perhaps you mentioned it in the beginning. You said that Jung and all that was dealing with the process in the middle of the cycle, whereas the occultist was more dealing with the beginning and the end. Well, okay. What I am interested in as a thinker, as a philosopher, and an astrologer also in a sense, is essentially to try to understand the meaning of the cycle as a whole, the cycle of a life as a whole, the cycle of the planet as a whole, of mankind as a whole, where it fit into the larger pattern. Now, the fact is that the process of evolution, which I described this morning, from a small local thing to a global things, then to the solar system, then to the galaxy and all that, that process is there. I mean, there is no use to deny it. We have developed a consciousness which is able to move from one of this lower level or lesser level of integration to a higher level of integration. the point is that every one of those levels of integration, all those organisms, all those systems of integrated activities and all that, exist even from an empirical point of view. The galaxy exists, the solar system exists. We are beginning to be able to relate to it in some way, because we have developed a certain kind of mental faculties and instrument as a result, which enable us to contact and to see ourselves in terms of another frame of reference. Now, all what I am trying to say is that the experimentalist, the empiricist, sees life in terms of a very small frame of reference, which is defined purely by the senses. And even that, in terms of mankind, he limits that to a certain experience of only a certain really group of men, because the experience in India, in China, and in many places, and even here, have different experiences which don't fit that frame of reference. Well, if those experiences don't fit that frame of reference, then the necessity arises to bring it in relation to a larger frame of reference. And that's all what I am trying to do, and what the real occultist is trying to do, or esotericist. Occultist is such a bad word today, I mean, the way it's used. But you see, is to try to see the thing from a larger frame of reference. From the point of view of mankind as a whole, and I explained this morning, which really means from the point of view of the Earth as a whole, and eventually the solar system and galaxy and so on. Now, all what the occultist says, okay, we may not be normally able to experience the realities of that larger frame of reference, because we may not have the senses, if it can be experienced sensually or sensorially. We need perhaps the other senses which may have been latent or are not awakened or were awakened and we closed for some reason. And we do not have perhaps the mind to perceive the correlation between all those things. So what we are doing is what the Hermeticist or the occultist has been doing, was to use the concept of holism in terms of correspondence, in terms of analogy, and saying, all right, this is a small system of activity, interrelated, interdependent activity, and there is a larger one. We believe that there is that smallness or largest frame of reference still, in a certain sense, is structured by the same universal forces or principle of activities. Therefore, you can infer from what is happening in the little frame of reference, which is man, which we know more or less about, at least at a certain level, and a larger frame of reference, which we call the solar system or the galaxy or the universe and so on. So that you are not making a jump, you see. I think the idea of making a jump, I think, is completely a false way to look at it. You just simply realize the fact that we have reached the connection with a larger frame of reference, and as yet we know very little about that frame of reference. And we induce, at least as a theory, that there is a certain analogical correspondence between any system of reference, which, as if we can go to the basic function. Right. Now, okay, that's where astrology comes in a certain sense. It says, for instance, you can make a birth chart of a human being. In that birth chart, there are certain functions. There is the function of self-maintenance. There is the function of expansion. There is this function of going out toward the thing that you need, of bringing your experience inside in correlation with memory and all that, so that you can find the value of it. There is the thing of expansion, there is the thing of self-reproduction, and there is the function of self-transformation. I mean, those are probably the most basic functions, you might say. Well, this function exists just as well in a business firm. It has to also have a structure of its own. It has to maintain that structure. It has to expand, it has to contact the world, it has to do what do you call it, auditing, accounting, and all those kind of things. So in a business firm, there are the same kind of function as well as, more or less, if you go basic and not literal, as to in the human body. Well, all right, we how do you call that, extrapolate that concept to the idea that any larger unit, which also could be considered as an independent and self-reliant and self-operating balanced load system of activity, will also have certain basic function. And so you extrapolate from that. And so you deduce from that as an a priori system of deduction that this and this is likely to happen structurally. Now there is a very interesting quote there and something in that thing of Jung.
Here it is.
And which shows, for instance, what he's doing the same thing in that sense. Who is it? Very interesting about crystals. He said, again and again, I encounter the mistaken notion that an archetype is determined in regard to its content. In other words, that it is a kind of unconscious idea, if such an expression be admissible. It is necessary to point out once more that archetypes are not determined as regard their contents, but only as regard their form, and only to a very limited degree. A primordial image is determined as to its content only when it has become conscious and is therefore filled out with material of conscious experience. Its form, however, as I have explained elsewhere, might perhaps be compared to the axial system of a crystal, which, as it were, preform the crystalline structure in the mother liquid, although it has no material existence of its own. This first appears according to the specific way in which the ions and molecules aggregate. The archetype in itself is empty and purely formal, nothing but a facultas preformandi, a possibility of representation which is given a priori. The representations themselves are not inherited, only the forms, and in that respect they correspond in every way to the instincts, which are also determined in form only.
Now this is reasoning by analogy.
Well,
essentially, by metaphor.
It's reasoning by analogy, but you see, what he's doing there is just what I was saying. He's taking for granted that he has an hypothesis which he called the collective unconscious or the psyche, and that psyche has a form that has certain basic structural patterns, which he calls archetypes. Mm-hmm. And those archetypes structure the psyche just as certain line of forces structure a crystal, just as functional relationship between the different organs of the body structure the whole body, mm-hmm. and in genetic code and all that. So if you say that, why not say that the planet Earth, which we have realized, especially since the time of the geophysical year, which we have really found that every kingdom of life, everything that is in the planet, every sea current, ocean current, air current, stratospheric current, Van Allen band, all those things like that, are completely interrelated and interdependent. Touch one and everything else.
Let me respond on two levels. One, a personal response, and the other, trying to put myself in Jung's head, which is hard to do. But the personal response, and when I hear Rudhyar talk in the way he was just talking, it turns me on. And one of the reasons that I came to know and love your work is that in a personal sense, I resonate to the kind of thing, that model, that kind of idea of the larger wholes and the larger personality. So that in terms of my own personal kind of subjective response, I can identify with that as truth in a certain kind of way. And that in itself, that kind of phenomenon of the individual responding to the idea presented by the other, may be a clue as to how we can bridge this gap. But let me take one step farther back from that. As I understand Jung, in the analogy, in the reading that you quoted there, the one thing Jung did not do was to imply personality or consciousness to the archetype. He was reasoning by analogy, but the step or leap he did not take was to imply that the archetype possessed either personality or consciousness. Now that seems to me the further step that Jung was hesitant to take.
Yeah, but you see that the question of personality is a very misunderstood point. As to the matter of consciousness, it again depends on the definition of consciousness.
True.
I mean, for the Hindu, consciousness is something that pervades the whole universe, just as life pervades the whole universe. You have the one life which pervades the whole universe, which is focused into an individual.
But let me just interrupt to say that Jung, speaking to that point, might say, if I experience such universal consciousness myself, that's okay. But since I have no way of demonstrating its existence, I have no business selling it to others.
But why should Jung consider his reaction important?
Why his own reaction important?
Yeah, I don't consider my reaction important.
I've lost the meaning of the question. Oh, I see. All right.
I mean, you see,
because he was operating from the point of view from the central reference point of individual consciousness.
Yeah, but you see, that is to me where the mistake is, you see. The question, you see, in a certain sense, is, again, coming back to that nothing is not a matter of truth. It's a matter of what is important and what is meaningful and valid at any particular time.
Mm-hmm.
Now, if you take mankind and that which deal with the very basic structure of the type of things, the type of organism which you are dealing with. Now, if I know that I am a human being, I can see I have the same functions and all that, and I am part of a certain race, I am part of a certain culture, of a certain time, which I know is part of an evolution of mankind and things like that. Now, you can, if I see that a whole culture and all that is saying something and a certain experience, and which I don't have those experiences, I am not going to say that those experiences are false because I don't have them. That to me is acme of pride and selfishness.
Now I think, again, trying to think through Jung's head, I think he might respond that each of us individually is, after all, locked inside his own head. That the point of view of individual...
I don't believe that.
Yeah, but this is the a priori assumption I think he starts from. Let me quote, I want to make this clear. I want to be sure I distinguish it between what I'm trying to say and what I think Jung would say. I'm going to make a quote, I think it's to this point, from this is from the introduction to the Tibetan Book of the Great Liberation, written in 1939. We do not assume that the mind is a metaphysical entity or that there is any connection between an individual mind and a hypothetical universal mind. We do not assume. Then he proceeds.
Well, that's an assumption, all right.
Yeah, but he doesn't assume.
No.
Yeah.
I mean, you know, that's a definite assumption.
That's correct. In other words, it's the negative. He takes a negative position on this question. Right. Our psychology is therefore a science of mere phenomena without any metaphysical implications. The development of Western philosophy during the last 2 centuries has succeeded in isolating the mind in its own sphere and in severing it from its primordial oneness with the universe. Man himself has ceased to be the microcosm and eidolon of the cosmos, and his anima is no longer the consubstantial scintilla or spark of the anima mundi, the world's soul. He's referring here to the idea that Jung, as you know, puts a heavy emphasis upon the absence of the primitive experience, the participation mystique in the modern mind. And he talks a lot about the disconnectedness of modern consciousness from the collective world, but he keeps it internal. Psychology accordingly treats all metaphysical claims and assertions as mental phenomena. Psychology accordingly treats all metaphysical claims and assertions as mental phenomena and regards them as statements about the mind and its structure that derive ultimately from certain unconscious dispositions. See, it's a different kind of.
You see, all those things, I mean, are all right, but you see, they are the most fantastic taken for granted. I mean, you have absolutely no proof of all those things being valid at all. All what you can say is that modern science in the last 2 or 3 centuries has taken a terrific bias where it has consciously focused itself along a certain line where it has refused to close its mind to everything what was not in that one direction. And my point is that, sure, that is exactly what Western society has done, and therefore it is now killing itself. And therefore we are in a situation where it is absolutely imperative that you take a completely different point of view, a different approach for the universe, and to man in general.
Now, actually, I think the position that Jung is taking here is less the empirical position than it is the phenomenological position. Well, he's saying, in effect, I'm locked inside my head, and my mind cannot conceive of anything beyond itself. I mean,
but it is not locked inside of his head because he's using a language which is a cultural phenomenon. He's constantly in rapport with everything else. Mm-hmm. He's constantly spilling his psychic reaction and all that on everybody else. To say that the mind is locked within one's head, to me, is the most gross misunderstanding of actually what is taking place.
Well, he doesn't even act as if his mind were locked out. Yeah, I mean, he says it, but he doesn't.
Well, no, I think this is the important distinction, is that he does act as if it is when he is in what he considers to be his formal work, that is the work of acquiring knowledge, which is legitimately communicable to others. When he is in subjective mode, that is, talking from his own personal experience, then he's willing to be metaphysical. Let me just take it further, because I want to be sure that I'm not misquoting Jung, and this is an important passage here. I just read this part. Psychology accordingly treats all metaphysical claims and assertions as mental phenomena, and regards them as statements about the mind and its structure that derive ultimately from certain unconscious dispositions. It does not consider them to be absolutely valid, or even capable of establishing a metaphysical truth. I guess he's saying here that this is an a priori assumption that he's going on. We have no intellectual means of ascertaining whether this attitude is right or wrong. Even his own attitude he's referring to. We only know that there is no evidence for and no possibility of proving the validity of a metaphysical postulate such as universal mind. If the mind asserts the existence of a universal mind, we hold that it is merely making an assertion. He's not disagreeing with it, but he's saying it is not establishing it a truth, it is only making an assertion. We do not assume that by such an assertion the existence of a universal mind has been established. There is no argument against this reasoning, but no evidence either that our conclusion is ultimately right. In other words, it is just as possible that our mind is nothing but a perceptible manifestation of a universal mind. Yet we do not know, and we cannot even see, how it would be possible to recognize whether this is so or not. Psychology therefore holds that the mind cannot establish or assert anything beyond itself. But you see, he makes a very fine point here. He doesn't, in bringing up the question of universal mind, he doesn't argue against its existence, nor is he arguing for it. He's saying it is something which must remain unknown. Yeah, and he likes it to remain unknown rather than to, what I'm calling taking the leap, is to move to a definite assertion about its reality. He likes to leave the question open, as opposed to drawing a conclusion that there either is or is not such a universal mind.
But you see, perhaps another way to say it, you see, my approach to the things like that, I am not interested in Jung as a person. No more I am interested in Hitler as a person. I am interested in the function which they fulfill in a particular culture.
In a larger context.
Which has a certain cycle and which had reached a certain point, and where certain processes are going on. Now, there is a certain process that started with Freud, and which correspond to, astrologically, to that famous conjunction of Neptune and Pluto in 91, 92, brought in X-rays, radium, and then the quantum theory, and then the complex theory and the Freudian theory, and all those things like that. Something happened there in a certain sense in the central, even in Central Europe, and all those things you see are part of a certain pattern. And my point is not that the Jung has to be as his own particular, as a person doesn't interest me at all. What is interesting is the thing that he plays in molding the collective mind, the collective consciousness of a particular culture.
By the way, this is what I meant when I said that your point of view would take collective to collective through the individual. In a way, it's almost like you said that right back to me using different words just now.
Well, but I don't know why you say from collective to collective.
The collective is is more important. It has relatively more value than the person.
Wait. Collective, I'm not speaking of collective in the sense of Jung called collective, or
I'm not even
conscious, you see. I am speaking there in terms of a definite structure. It's an entity. Entity in the sense that any system is an entity.
Right.
And there is such a system in the mind of the planet, really, or mankind if you want, but there is a system that is developed which you call the Western culture, the Western society. There was before a thing of the Chinese society and the thing, the Toynbee speaks of those different society and so on. Each one has a certain function to perform things. Certain things happen to that society. And individuals arise who are born at a certain point, at a certain time, to fill the need of that particular development or evolution of that society or that culture at that time. Now, Jung came there a little later, or about the same time as Freud. It's part of the thing. There is a kind of balance thing that had Freud against so far in a certain way that he had to go the other way. But it was part of the scientific pattern that had been developed since the 17th century, and therefore, in a certain sense, Jung, in order to fulfill his function, had to retain his reliability as an empiricist scientist. And therefore, he had to be empirical whether he wanted it or not, because it was his function to do it within that particular culture at that particular time. Now, another person come at another time and does something else. Hitler come at a certain time where certain catabolic forces had been built up within the Central European pattern, the whole consciousness had been broken. There had been a over-expansion of that Germany, the whole, and this kind of thing, which was returning to the fact that the Germanic people were at the root of that racially, of the root of that European society. And now if that European society is reaching a certain point of omega point or something like that, then there is a crisis will tend to pull and reawaken the unconscious tribal things of the early Germanic race. Nazism is nothing but neo-tribalism, one folk, one land, the expansion thing of early little tribes and so on. It's magnified, and the only reason why it was able to kill so many people was because of modern technology, which was built up by that Western culture, part of which he came to destroy. And that is the function that he occupied at a certain time. He became a mouthpiece for catabolic forces, which were far beyond the little man Hitler, but used him, his voice, his emotional frustration and all that in order to build a certain thing.
Now, you see, the point, I would find myself agreeing with what you've said, but seeing it as perhaps somewhat incomplete, but it's perhaps because I don't understand. when you made the point that Jung as a person does not interest you, I did a double take.
Well, I mean, in a sense,
As a person.
it's interesting as any human being, any phenomenon is interesting in the sense. But I mean, in discussing at this idea, and he said that himself in that thing that I was reading there, he said, we have come to realize that there is no such thing, that the truth even of a philosopher or of a philosophy belong to his temperament, and that he is an expression of his temperament. I have made studies, I have a series of articles on the depth psychology, which eventually will be published, I think, and to show that the chart of any of those psychologists of Jung and Freud and Adler and Astrologer and all that were absolute reflection, symbol of the philosophy that, or the psychology they developed, you see. Freud.
Now, okay, let me pick it up from there, because I want to go back to a point which I think is very central. I'm still back somewhat on this point of your not being interested in Jung as a person. Now let me.
Well, in the same sense that I don't think I'm interesting as a person either.
All right, no, okay.
Astrologer has to detach himself from the personality.
All right, you can make a case that the psychiatrist should also.
Yes.
And that's gotten us psychiatrists in lots of trouble that we're just now beginning to get out of. In other words, we psychiatrists were trained in the first 3/4 of the 20th century to detach ourselves from the personhood of the patient and to deal with him objectively, until we slowly began to realize that in so doing, we were recreating the same pathological circumstances that made him sick to begin with. Now we're just beginning to come out of the dark ages of our own specialty and realizing that the quality of relationship in dealing with the individual as a person is of primary importance. Now,
May I just say
go ahead.
just one word there, because you see the question again, you have to be very careful what you mean by person and personality. When I say that I'm not interested in the personality and all that, I don't mean I am interested in the personality just like I am interested in a good violin or a good piano. But if it's a beautiful instrument, and through that instrument something is pouring, that's what I call by the transpersonal life.
Right.
But the question is, what is pouring through belong to a larger frame of reference, which can be studied, to my mind, more significantly in terms of the need of a particular culture and the particular things and so on. Just like if you study a certain cell and you make a certain test on my stomach at the moment, well, you have to take it in terms of what the food that I have eaten and how the chemical that is going on and things like that. So the larger pattern affect that particular cell. And my point in relation to Jung and that thing, or to anybody, or Hitler or anybody, is that we really cannot understand any person or any historical thing, that the whole historical thing, great individual doing great thing. But what is yes, of course, they were great individuals and they did great thing, bad or good, or destructive or constructive. But to me, you cannot understand that personality unless you understand it in terms of a larger frame of reference.
I can agree on that point, and I think Jung would also. Perhaps there'd be some difference on what the larger frame of reference would amount to, but this isn't the point I'm making now. I think there's a danger in attempting only to understand the personality. I think there's another thing that one must do, and that is to relate, and to relate to the individual at any moment of time, as though he indeed is, and this is another myth perhaps, or another truth, a unique phenomenon that never was before and will never be again. This is the kind of thing I think that Martin Buber talks about, for example, in I and Thou, the kind of quality of relationship. This is the kind of thing that the existentialist analysts came along to make a very specific corrective to the Freudian point of view. Namely that the relating to the person, whether it's Jung or anyone else, as person, is something beyond relating to him in a perspective or with understanding. It is the act of relationship itself, in and of itself, which has meaning, truth, and significance.
Yes, if you meet him, I mean, if you are dealing with
if you are dealing with him
person,
directly, yeah, that's
but
correct.
we were dealing about the ideas, you see, that's a different matter.
Right, but I think, again, there's a polarity here. You see, we have on one end of the polarity the ideas, and on the other end of the polarity we have the act of meeting or of relationship. And that is a unique phenomenon and is not in and of itself relatable to larger wholes or to a larger perspective. It is thus. It is Dasein, as Heidegger would say.
Well, but that's the difference.
In and of itself.
The difference I make between the existential world of relatedness and the structural world of self, where you are dealing with definite function and dharmas and all that. The self is a dharma, it's a function, as I see it. It's different from Jung to some extent, not too much, but to some extent. But you see, there are two things. There is the structural realm or the structural approach, and there is the existential approach. Now, if you are dealing with this existential approach and you meet with another person, and in terms of the realities of that person, the need of that person, then of course that other person is supremely important for you as a person at that time. But when you are dealing with a historical personage who has generated a current of thought or a current of activities or something like that, then to merely say, well, he did that because he had a frustration, because maybe his father was Jewish and he hated to be Jewish or something like that, and therefore he, this kind of thing, like Hitler, maybe, the story, and or whatever it is. Then, of course, you don't really see to me, the most relevant thing. It is what that person does into the larger pattern.
And I agree, except that there's one addition. For example, during the period of the first 2 or 3 years after John Kennedy's assassination, clinically, I found him appearing in the dreams of many, many people, including my own. Now, John Kennedy obviously appeared in form other than John Kennedy, but each experience was an intensely personal one. You see, the personal and the impersonal came together in that experience. And it seems to me that there's a danger in dealing with reality as from the larger perspective only. It's not that I'm arguing with dealing with reality from the larger perspective, but that there's a danger in dealing with it only unless you balance with the opposite polarity of the existential element. That somehow these two, to go back to a Jungian kind of concept, must be held in a kind of dynamic tension in the moment of relating or meeting or doing or creating or whatever, experiencing.
Well, I said that at first, you see, in my Astrology of Personality book, I said that the reason why I tried to bring together Jungian or depth psychology and astrology is because, as I saw it, the psychologist knew all the details, existential detail, or at least lots of them, from the patient, but he had no idea as to the structure of his destiny as a whole, the whole pattern from birth to death. Mm-hmm. The astrologer had an idea of the pattern of destiny from birth to death, but it was a purely formal thing and no idea what kind of event would fill in. And therefore, by bringing astrology and depth psychology together, you were bringing the existential with the structural. At the ascendant in astrology, or the first house, especially at the ascendant, refer to those type of experience through which you are best able to gain an awareness of the essential individuality. It is the essence as an opposition to existence. So the self is the essential nature of that particular person that you are. And it is but it is unconscious. It is power. It just simply is, And it is only through the polarity of relatedness and through relationship, to attraction and repulsion and all that there is the possibility for the organisms which contain those two poles to bring into consciousness that basic tone of the self. So in that sense, the self is the alpha, which at the end becomes the omega. But it is the same thing, you say. Only the alpha is unconscious power. It's the sheer impulsion to be, but with a definite form, with a definite particular character, which will then actualize itself through the whole cycle. And through the process of relationship, you see, to the seventh house in the chart, the descendant, there will be group relationship, association that will bring a certain process of common living and all that, language and so on, which will bring the capacity for consciousness, a form mind through which consciousness can focus itself. And it will eventually, supposedly, bring that dawn, the self, out into consciousness.
I think that Jung would agree partly with that definition of self. There would be some difference, I think, in terms of rather than seeing it.
Sometimes he says things that are almost
that are very similar. I think the thing that would be the difference would, I'm aware, for example, in some of his informal lectures where he was again tripping out metaphysically, Jung drew a diagram of the evolution of consciousness as a spiral. It's as though he says the self. He would agree with the first part. That is, I think that he would go along with the idea of power and the unrealized aspect and the bringing into consciousness. But I think what he probably would not go along with would be necessarily seeing. He would see the self as open-ended and its kind of its ultimate function as inevitably unknown, rather than tying it to the close of the cycle and the beginning of a new cycle, I think.
Well, it's open in the sense that the close of a cycle is not exactly a repetition of the beginning, because out of all the existential experience of all the parts that have related to each other and all that, there is a new quality which has emerged, and it produces also a new kind of failures, which in turn will arise to a new cycle, so that in a sense it's open-ended. Every human being who has a collective or social cultural functions is born under condition where the thing that he has to bring, the message that he has to bring, comes to him in answer to his own needs, so that it becomes a personal thing, which gives it an emotional, an existential intensity, which otherwise it would not have. It would be purely an abstract thing, you see. So that you are always born in the condition which is the polar opposite of the very thing that it is your message to give to the world.
And so the process of personal individuation becomes one of bringing into consciousness that opposite.
Yeah. But the difference between you and the average person in that situation which has that need is that they are under the need. They are dominated by that need. But you can react against that need, you see, and find the solution. You reacted by opening something in you, which then the universe or God or whatever you want to call it, present you with the answer. Mm-hmm. I mean, it's not a present like in a basket, but gradually it comes to you.
Let me just, we're really close to our time to close, and let me make just one or two remarks and then turn it over to Rudhyar to close the meeting. I wanted to say in summary, I found myself, again, remind you that I found myself split in my presentation today, but trying to separate out and put myself into the hypothetical head of another man, which of course is an impossible task. And many of the questions that I've raised have been inevitably in a kind of conflictual modality, of raising an issue or raising a question, to sharpen some of the distinctions as well as the parallels. I find that in contrast with my own personal take. In other words, go back to the comment that I read Rudhyar and I've gotten to know him because he turns me on, and I like that. And because it turns me on, it brings me, for me, there is no major conflict, and it goes back to your comment. between these 2 points of view. I think one is an elaboration of the other, perhaps. And the only real kind of cautionary thing about the metaphysical point of view, or for that matter, the occult point of view, that I would keep from Jung is the caution to keep it one's personal truth, and to not try to generalize upon it in such a way as to interfere with another man's personal truth or personal myth, if you want to put it that kind of way. But aside from that one cautionary point, I find myself extremely consonant with Rudhyar's thinking, and I think Jung is very consonant with Rudhyar's thinking too. But Rudhyar addresses himself to questions that Jung preferred not to address himself to. And I think this is a very central point. I think we have to keep this in mind. So the 2 points of view become complementary and not really contradictory in many senses. Now there is this one question about at what point it's legitimate to talk in terms of metaphysics. Jung talks metaphysically. I read you a passage from Memories, Dreams, and Reflections, which is a metaphysical statement, you see. So it's very difficult to find real differences. I think that Rudhyar amplifies Jung in the sense that he moves into areas of question, and then using your own terminology to the beginning and ends of cycles, that Jung was not concerned with, and very deliberately so. So that kind of summarizes my point of view. Rudhyar, you want to?
Well, it's fine. I have nothing to summarize. My point, perhaps I should say that I don't consider myself as a metaphysician at all. I don't deal with metaphysics. I deal with cosmic reality. I deal with the fact that we are at a certain point where, existentially speaking, we are moving from one frame of reference to another frame of reference, which create a great problem of transitional readjustment and the possibility for individuals everywhere to transform themselves, to renew themselves, to relate themselves to a larger frame of reference, which you call it mankind, the earth, or humanity, or whatever you want to call it. And my approach to occultism and all that is also in terms of that higher frame of reference. I am trying to bring a little more, less glamour and to the certain things that have to deal with that other frame of reference, so that you look at it in terms of principle rather than in terms of personification, and so that you are able to I stress the idea of the cycle because I think it is necessary at the present time. It is a concept which has been cut out from the whole of Western society by the Council of Constantinople in 400 something or other, and which has declared heretic anything having to do with cycle and reincarnation and reappearance and things like that. It had a very definite reason for the development of European culture. Modern science in the 17th century and the 18th century had a definite meaning to sharpen the mind, to focus on certain things, dealing with very concrete substance and all that, and not only idealistic concept. All that is fine, but I think that we have come to a point where this is shown to be unsatisfactory, unwelcome. I mean, not unwelcome, but obsolete and leading to conditions which are very self-destructive for mankind. And so that there is a need to evolve into a new type of frame of reference, which involves, therefore, a new type of consciousness. And that's all what I am trying to do. And as a person, I am trying to live as fully as I can. I've had a difficult life in some respect, rather weak body, very definite. I was supposed to die many times, though I am 78 now, so I'm still alive. And but all that, of course, was necessary for a certain reason, and I can go even back in the past and century to find the reason why those things happen, the function of these things happen. It's a matter of intuition, in the sense that it is a matter of perceiving, of realizing things which are structural, which refer to basic principles, which you apprehend directly.
just as you apprehend directly a body or light through your senses and through your eye. It is not in any way different, it is not in any way less a matter of perception or apperception or apprehension, but it deals with a different level. And if we can develop that level, if we can learn to live in terms of those structural factors, which you might call archetype, or perhaps not in the Jungian sense exactly, but in the Platonic sense, or ideas, or you come to a point where you can experience ideas, which that is your world, which is not a fantasy, it is not a matter of, it may be polarized by a certain existential event and experience, relationships and all that, yes, sure. But still, it has brought a situation where you can live in that realm and experience it almost directly in some way, and where you have as much the sense of right and wrong, or true and false, as you have in the sense of valuing this is good for me or this is not good for my body at this level. So it is just a matter of adding a new dimension, a new level of structure, a new awareness of the fullness of existence. We should believe in as much fullness as can believe, and without missing everything as much as possible. And if you, for some reason, have to miss something in order to focus at a certain level, well, try to realize that there is a need for balancing it, and you balance it, if not necessarily at the physical level, then you balance it at the more irrational level of artistic creation and all that and so on. So it is all really very simple, and I think that the only trouble is that we are conditioned by a Western culture and civilization and our academia, which unfortunately has absorbed not only all the microbes of Europe, but because it's virgin soil, has made them bigger and better. and so that the whole question is, what is our attitude to our Western civilization, our Western society? My attitude that it should nicely go to bed. And that's something which should emerge of it, which is not a denial of the values that have been reached, but which is a completely reintegration of those value of the spiritual harvest, of the new kind of mental faculty that have been developed, to reintegrate them into a completely new frame of reference, where instead of being the most focalized and glorified function, it is merely a secondary function, which is part of something which we still don't quite understand because it's still beyond us, but we can grow towards it and gradually develop it.
I wanted to say before we quit, a personal note to Rudhyar. Rudhyar shared with me the thought before we started this last session. He said, "You talk a lot because my voice is tired." And but Rudhyar being the man that he is, he had to share with us who he is, and I wanted to extend a personal appreciation for the opportunity to enter into this dialogue, and for you extending yourself to us as you have this afternoon. This is a long and hard kind of time, and I wanted to give you, it's been personally a great privilege to be a participant in this dialogue, even though supposedly speaking for another man who probably would say everything I had to say about him was all wet. But it certainly has been a personally rewarding and moving experience, and I wanted to give you my thanks, and I'm sure the thanks of all of us.